Senator, the Honorable Matthew Samuda, our Minister, and I'm going to give you a long title later, but let's just say Minister in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, and I'll explain in a few moments. Ms. Emmanuel from CRIF, who has been with us all the way through. Our Council Political from the South African High Commission, Ms. Mukendi. Our guest speaker for today, he's no longer a guest, he's been here a week and has completely put himself at our disposal, but we would like to welcome him specially, Professor Engelbrecht, Dean Taylor, Deputy Dean Stevenson, Professor Ramsey from the P.J. Patterson Institute, welcome. Members of the conference participants, welcome. Members from the Climate Change Advisory Board, I see at least 3 members who have made it here, welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, and I think that includes everybody else, good afternoon and welcome. Good afternoon and welcome. Okay. We are here because we are on the cusp of a new discussion which has taken us by storm for all of this week. I could say a lot about climate change, but that's going to take us quite a while. It's here, it's real, and it's time to do something about it. There's a growing recognition that there's a need for accountability, and I always thought I would hold those accountable by having more information. Well, having more information has given us the leverage so that those who are most vulnerable will be able to say and do more. SIDS are at the greatest threat, of course, and the Caribbean sits in the middle of that cross-section. More frequent and intense hurricanes, higher temperatures, unpredictable rainfall, rising sea levels, and I could go on and on. At COP29, there was a decision to enforce, create, establish loss and damage. Now, we know that that fund is nowhere near it needs to be, but it's a start. But within that, don't we need to know a bit more about how we're going to take responsibility? How is that fund going to be used? We need to be able to detect and attribute so that we are better able to claim what it is we wish to do. Detection is a process of demonstrating that climate change had some impacts or has some roots in places which are beyond or not beyond normal statistical values. Attribution is a process of establishing the causes that have given you this variation, fluctuation. Is it real, is it not? Where can we place it? Is it a natural thing or is it due to man-made contributions? The science, therefore, of DNA is very new and is taking over the world. It may be fair to say that those responsible are usually to the north and those impacted are usually to the south. It is no surprise then that Professor Taylor and Professor Stevenson and the Climate Studies Group at Mona reached out on a south-south connection to find those who have started work in DNA and to bring them here for a discussion. This is our first ever conference workshop in detection and attribution, and we're very pleased, and we'd like to say thank you to the Climate Studies Group, Mona, for initiating, promulgating, keeping us working at it, and I think we have one more week to go. We therefore are at the end of that first week, and for those of you who have been here for the entire time, you're going to have the icing on the cake. For those of you who have not been here for the entire time, you are going to get the tip of the iceberg and wonder what it is you have not gotten. So as we begin, I'm going to ask for a couple of greetings, then I will ask for our introduction of our guest speaker, and then we will hear from the man himself. So as I start, our first greeting is going to come from our partners. There are many partners who have made this possible, and partnership always works. The Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, the National Environment Planning Agency, the Forestry Department, the Caribbean Community for Climate Change Center, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility Segregated Portfolio Company, the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy, and the South African High Commission. Our first greeting is going to come from Ms. Elizabeth Emmanuel, who is head of the Technical Assistance and Corporate Communications Portfolio, CRIF SPC. CRIF, as you might know, is the world's first multi-country, multi-peril, risk pool-based parametric insurance which is a mouthful to say everything that comes under disaster risk and planning for it, and if you can forecast for it and save for it. See how much I learned from your last talk, Liz? The facility has 23 members, 19 in the Caribbean and 3 in Central America, and I hear that there are more about to join. Many have benefited and more are about to. But to tell us more about CRIF and to bring her greetings, we invite Ms. Liz Emanuel. Liz?
Thank you very much, Prof. Minister Samuda, the South African High Commission, other distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. This is kind of imposing. All right, so I am here from CRIF SPC, formerly the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, and we are a part sponsor of the Detection and Attribution Science Workshop being hosted by the Climate Studies Group in the Faculty of Science and Technology at Mona. And I'm not seeing Prof, but I think, yes, you're there. You do have an additional invoice for us. Please send it soonest. We are pleased to be invited to speak this afternoon at this public lecture. As I said at the opening ceremony on Monday, the event this week is one of several initiatives that CRIF has supported or implemented with the University of the West Indies. We have had 3 memoranda of understanding with the University of the West Indies since 2010. So we have been solid partners with UE. These memorandum of understanding are underpinned by work plans, funded work plans, in which we do a range of projects and programs with different departments at UE. I think right now we're also working on something to do with Negril and climate change and the coastline, and we have another study coming up with UE St. Augustine to do with climate change and citizens' participation, etc. And of course, we have been working over the years with the Climate Studies Group. We have provided at least $1.5 million to the University of the West Indies in the form of scholarships, internships, studies, etc. But this evening, I want to respond quickly or answer 3 questions. What is CRIF? But Prof. Weber told you a little bit about that. What does CRIF and the parametric insurance products that we provide have to do with loss and damage? And why are we taking this sort of deep interest in supporting the University of the West Indies? As Prof. Weber indicated, CRIF is the world's first multi-country, multi-peril risk pool based on parametric insurance. Indeed, we're also the most successful risk pool based on parametric insurance. There are 4 risk pools in the world today, CRIF being the first, with 3 other risk pools that were adopted and adapted from the CRIF model. CRIF was launched in 2007 following Hurricane Ivan, which caused significant damage across 9 countries in the Caribbean. At that point, we could no longer be each other's brother's keeper because there were several countries that were impacted. And what that led, and in fact, it was Jamaica who started the discussions around having something in place that could result in Caribbean governments accessing quick liquidity following a natural disaster. Indeed, if any of you were here last week or viewed via UE TV, Ivan Plus 20, you would have heard the then Minister of Finance, Omar Davies, saying that when he went to Grenada and he realized the damage from Hurricane Ivan, he said to the donors, and he told them, don't call yourself donors anymore, because you don't give people loans when you see that kind of impact. And Jamaica, along with other CARICOM heads of government, went to the World Bank president and said, can we find a solution for quick liquidity following a natural disaster? The Japanese government came forward and provided a grant to allow for several assessments to take place. And those assessments led to the creation of the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility in 2007, with parametric insurance being deemed the instrument through which countries could access quick liquidity following a natural disaster, liquidity that will help to reduce the volatility on the budget, liquidity that could be used to help the most vulnerable in the population, for example. Indeed, CRIF was never designed to cover all the losses on the ground, but to provide an immediate injection of liquidity within 14 days of a natural hazard event. In 2007, when we started, CRIF had 2 products for tropical cyclones and earthquakes. Today, we have 6 products. Tropical cyclones, earthquakes, excess rainfall for the fishery sector, the water utility sector, and the electric utility sector. So Minister Samuda, we're providing coverage to NWC, or we would like to provide coverage for the water utility sector. Today, it's not 23 members that we have, but 26. So we have 19 Caribbean, 3 Central American governments, 3 electric utility companies, and we are to announce several new members for this policy year, which started on June 1 in the electric utility sector, new members in Central America, the water utility sector, as well as 1 tourist resort in the Caribbean that has taken out parametric insurance. It's a tourist attraction. Our members continue to see parametric insurance as key to advancing their development prospects, and many countries such as, well, Jamaica, of course, is a leading example in terms of disaster risk financing because it not only has parametric insurance, but it also has a suite of other instruments recognizing that the frequency and intensity of different events, we have different layers of risk that we need to take into account. And in deciding on the instruments we choose, we also need to recognize that parametric insurance is for catastrophes. It's not for your so-so flooding or for smaller events that may take place. Since the inception of CRIF, we have made 64 payouts totaling $268 million to 17 of our members, and these payouts have impacted or benefited over 5 million persons because we do assessments on the use of payouts. But what does CRIF have to do with loss and damage? From as far back as 2012, the UNFCCC has been advocating that parametric insurance and CRIF is a strategy for loss and damage once we agree that loss and damage refers to the negative effects of climate change that occur despite mitigation and adaptation efforts. Today, CRIF's parametric insurance is cited as being able to help countries better manage the growing risk and losses due to climate change and the increasing uncertainty. Parametric insurance can address more than physical damage of assets and infrastructure because it does provide a solution to the economic exposure of countries as well as economic exposure of assets. With the increasing frequency and intensity of events caused by climate change, and the increasing losses of governments, business, and communities, parametric insurance can be viewed as being better able to match capital to the risk caused by climate change. In other words, parametric insurance and the use of risk pooling is more economically viable than traditional insurance for fiscally constrained countries. At CRIF, we are continuing to push the innovation needle, providing new products for new sectors, using our base products, tropical cyclone and excess rainfall products, to create products for the fishery sector, where we focus on the exposure of the fishery sector. For electric utilities, not for generation, because you can get indemnity insurance for generation facilities, but for overhead transmission and distribution. We insure the uninsurable. We are also adding policy endorsements. So, as I mentioned on Monday, if, for example, if you have a normal health policy as a woman, we can get a policy endorsement for breast cancer, for example. So we add that to our regular health policy. What we're doing is that we're adding policy endorsements to deal with climate change, increasing frequency and intensity. And my favorite endorsement is something called the RSIC, the reinstatement of sum insured cover. If you reach your coverage limit in 1 year, before the end of a year, for example, we have increasing storms. You can have $100 million in coverage for tropical cyclone, and you have 2 events that wipe that out. You can pay less than 40,000 US for the RSIC, which will immediately reinstate your 100 million coverage until the end of the year. And that is a game changer for us. We're looking now at micro events. We're seeing across the Caribbean, Little St. Lucia within the Little St. Lucia, having a very micro intense event that doesn't cause its main policy to trigger. But in those instances, we can look and see how we can support that community. So we have a policy endorsement for that. We have policy endorsements taking into account the wet season. We have subtypes where we have days of very small rainfall events. And then we may have a big event, but that doesn't register, but you have tons of landslides because you have saturated soil. So we have taken those things into account and provided policy endorsements. Both CRIF and the Climate Studies Group, MONA, we have many things in common. And I think we're both very modest organizations. But we have been cited globally as world-class organizations, with others adopting and adapting our work and models. We are providing scholarship on one hand and solutions on the other to address climate change and loss and damage. I am suggesting here today, as I did in my presentation on Monday, that both organizations collaborate more as we look to determine, for example, the best use of those loss and damage funds. How can we use insurance to ensure that the loss and damage funds can deliver more than the 700 million it has? And I suggested that investing some of those funds in insurance, it's 700 million. Maria cost the government of Dominica 1.2 million, right? Billion. It's 700 million, and it cost them 1.2 million US dollars. But if you invest some of those resources in parametric insurance, it means that 700 million that you now have in those funds multiplied by 10 in coverage will be 7 billion, right? So that is why it's important that from the insurance perspective and parametric insurance, we look at how we could use some of those loss and damage funds to increase the coverage levels of many of our countries that are underinsured against natural disasters, such as tropical cyclones. So we're looking to work with you on that so that those L&D funds can deliver much more. One of the things that I want to say here today is that reinsurance capacity, right? When you have insurance, you have to buy, insurance has to buy insurance. And that's what we call reinsurance. But reinsurance capacity for the Caribbean has been reducing. The capital markets in Europe and North America are providing less and less reinsurance capacity. So for those of you who have insurance for your homes, you're going to realize that every year now it's increasing more and more, and it's ridiculous because the reinsurance capacity is reducing. But the good thing is CRIF operates as a development insurance company. So we're not like a regular private insurance company where we make profit and we give it to shareholders. Once we pay all our bills, our profit go back into our members, either through reducing premium or developing technical assistance programs, working with communities to build resilience. And the reinsurers like that. And they are happy to be associated with a company who is seeking to build resilience. So guess what? We're getting reinsurance capacity where others are not. We actually had a very great program this year in terms of the cost of insurance, which means that what we're able to pass on to our members was reduce premium costs. So with that said, because we have that reinsurance capacity, it's also great for us to work closely together and for the Loss and Damage Fund to work with us. And I'll close by saying our support through this workshop has been possible through a very well-developed technical assistance program which underpins our role as a development insurance company. And we take that program, Isaac, our CEO, Isaac Anthony, he takes that program every year to the reinsurers who now want to be associated with the program and do stuff with the program. So we're focused on members' development needs, their prospects. We ensure that our surpluses go back to our members so that we can do work with organizations like the University of the West Indies. Our program so far has been in excess of 10 million US dollars, and it continues to grow. We have provided 175 scholarships to Caribbean nationals, and I'm encouraging you, the 2024-25 program closes on Saturday. Please apply so that I can push my board to give me more scholarships a year. If you don't apply, I can't do that. We have placed 171 young Caribbean nationals in internships since 2015. I see, is it the three of you? Two of you sitting down there. I see Ryan, I see Sophia. They were CRIF interns. I think we paid you between $900 and $1,000 US a month to be an intern. UWI gets a lot of interns. Minister Samuda, you can get one too. No, I'm serious. No, but I mean, they don't get that now. They're now professionals at 5Cs. But it's a great opportunity, and we encourage you. We have had interns at Climate Studies Group. We continue to support resilience building projects across the region in areas such as climate change adaptation, nature-based solutions, etc. Just Friday, we went to Bethel Isle in Mandeville to bring water to that community, Minister. We provided 50 1,000-gallon tanks and guttering to Bethel Isle community to bring water to that community under a small brand program. We want to continue to work with the UWI and deepen our engagement with CGSM as an important innovation and research hub to build a talent pool and skill sets in the region in the areas of climate science, loss and damage, catastrophe risk modeling, so that we have more persons in the region that could support the work that we do. But importantly, we want to be able to see how we can work with your team to better determine or attribute extreme weather events to anthropogenic climate change and ascertain to what extent certain events have become more frequent and more intense. We have data, you have data, we do studies, let us work together to ensure and safeguard the development prospects of the small island developing states, not just of the Caribbean, but of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manuel. It isn't often that you have a partner who says, let's collaborate more, and at the same time says, please send me your invoice. So if I were you, Michael, I would work on that. They're promising you interns, and they're telling you how much they're going to pay them. So, Minister, I think you have some interns coming your way. So we're here today because Professor Francois Engelbert is going to give us, as I said, the tip of the iceberg. When I first met him, I asked him, what kind of work does this really require? And his first word was modeling. And it's a lot of modeling and a lot of understanding, which clearly we have over the week been doing, and we're learning more. But I go back to the connection because he is from the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, which means we have a connection with South Africa. Jamaica and South Africa actually established diplomatic relations in 1994, 5 months after the first free democratic elections. And we've been partners since. There are actually 2 institutions with whom we have MOUs. And I'm putting it to you, Dean, that this needs to be 3, because all that we've learned from Prof. Francois means that there is a lot for us to share. The Consular Political from the South Africa High Commission is Ms. Presuma Mukendi, and I'm going to ask her to come forward and give greetings on behalf of our partners who have brought us this gem and continue to work with us.
Greetings. I am now feeling like I didn't really prepare for this after the previous speaker. Nonetheless, I will try my best just to greet, you know, because I was told by my boss that you just go there and you just deliver my greetings. So, Program Director, Professor Dale Weber, Honorable Minister Samuda, Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, Professor Michael Taylor, the Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology at the University of the West Indies, MONA, Professor Francois Engelbrecht, our speaker tonight, our person who's going to give us the lecture tonight, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change author and Professor of Climatology, Global Change Institute at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, academicians and scholars in various fields, students, members of the diplomatic corps, senior government officials, if any, amongst us here tonight, captains of business, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. South Africa is aligning its position with the global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt the economy to the impacts of climate change. The calamity that is caused by this climate change is real, and it is there for everyone to see. And as we all know that the contributors of these emissions vary in size and in global influence. It is therefore an honor for us as the South African High Commission to have Professor Francois Engelbrecht from the biggest university of, one of the biggest universities of South Africa, and probably the Southern Hemisphere, collaborating with this great institution of the Caribbean, the West Indies University, sharing with us on how we can mitigate and arrive at a fair climate justice. We are also pleased that the two institutions keep working together on matters of similar interest and thus directly promoting the bilateral relations between the two countries, South Africa and Jamaica. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to pass the warm greetings from the South African High Commissioner, Her Excellency Lumka Yengeni, and her entire staff at the High Commission. We wish you all the best for the ongoing workshop on climate detection and attribution, and we hope that you have had good deliberations thus far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Mukendi, for the greetings, and please do pass our greetings on to the High Commissioner when you see her. And I thank you for the pronunciation. I've been struggling with it. So it is Witwatersrand, right? Witwatersrand. I am saving you trying to pronounce this, Minister, but it gives me great pleasure to ask our minister, and you notice when I started I said he is the Minister without portfolio in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, which is a long title for a person who has a huge title because he is the minister responsible for water, environment, climate change, and the blue and green economies. I was fortunate enough to hear him at COP29 talk about greater ambition and greater action, and that progress on loss and damage was urgent but needed immediate financial interventions. He went on to talk about how we would scale up our actions and our plans to meet the need, but that early warning systems had to be put in place. Hard-won financial gains had to be converted into greater gains, and we had to rely on science to make the answer work. This week of conference has been all about science educating decision-making process. I'm going to invite Minister Samuda to bring his remarks.
Thank you, Prof, for that warm welcome as well as for the assistance with the pronunciation. Always good to be at the University of the West Indies. Allow me to acknowledge Chairman for the meeting, Professor Weber, Mrs. Mukendi. I assure you that we feel the same way speaking after Liz all the time. Ms. Elizabeth Emmanuel, Head Technical Assistance and Corporate Communications Manager for CRIF. Professor Engelbrecht, hope I've pronounced it correctly. And specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, Prof. Taylor. I'm grateful for the opportunity to attend and bring remarks to this inaugural workshop and public lecture on loss and damage and the urgent need for climate change attribution science in the Global South. And I'm happy to be here because it's good to see members of the NGO community come together with technical agency heads like CRIF, merging with academia, being supported by government to ensure that this important discussion takes life. We don't have a G20 that is particularly big on reparatory justice. And climate attribution studies is going to be the basis for the discussions that we will have related to loss and damage. When one looks at the distance in time between the Paris Agreement being signed and ratified and all the celebrations that would have taken place at that period, and you look at what it would have taken to get you to the loss and damage discussion, because I can't call it more than that yet, at COP28 and what has happened subsequently, we should all be very certain that this is incredibly important to furthering bringing loss and damage to life. As the world warms, loss and damage is going to become more and more apparent, more and more expensive, and more hurtful to societal stability. Jamaica lives climate change. Jamaica is not a nation that has the luxury of climate denial. 70% of our citizens live within 5 kilometers of the sea, usually low-lying areas, and we're seeing the awful effects of our slow onset events. I often say when you discuss it that people in spaces, certainly in the developed world, that may not yet be experiencing the worst effects of climate change, they think of it as a Category 5 storm. They think of the big fires in British Columbia last year. It's these catastrophic events, and we all know in this room that it is. But it's the slow onset events that has the debilitating effect on managing your economy and keeping societies together. It is the drought that we had last year, which is hard to film. It's not something you can capture theatrically. But when you have the sort of droughts that we are now experiencing and long dry periods that we're experiencing in Jamaica, you understand it in a real way. And I don't say that just because I have oversight of the water portfolio and do get calls at 4 a.m. when people don't have water in communities. But you see that impact when you have further learning loss because a school can't open because it doesn't have water. You see that impact when you get a call from a community that the health center on the one day that the doctor comes to this small rural community had a challenge with water, and you have to be nimble and moving around. You see that challenge, certainly if you work at the Water Commission and you get a call at 3 a.m. that KPH has a challenge with water, your largest hospital in the English-speaking Caribbean. And that's just on water. Climate change is affecting every part of our lives, every sector in our economy. When you live that close to the sea in low-lying areas, land loss is an issue. When so much of your economy depends on foreign exchange earned from tourism, which has sold sun, sand, and sea, losing your beaches is an issue. When you have saltwater intrusion and deteriorating soil quality affecting the output of your farmers, it's an issue. And that is our lived experience in Jamaica. We're living the experience of climate change. And we didn't cause it. We didn't cause it. It doesn't mean, however, that because we didn't cause it, that we don't have a moral obligation to ensure that our NDCs are not just a pretty document that we file and we celebrate filing earlier than other nations. We have a moral obligation to ensure that we decarbonize our economy. And that's something that's not often discussed. We need to understand the science and we need to explain the science to our citizens. And we have to explain the science to our citizens because otherwise it is a very tough conversation to explain to citizens of a developing country that you're asking them to develop in a particular manner that oftentimes is more expensive, slower, and more difficult to deal with. When you're talking to a developing nation about not using the cheapest source of energy, which will unlock economic growth and reduce poverty, etc., it's a difficult discussion. But the science and bringing academia along and having our NGOs that don't have the sort of trust deficit that politicians have is incredibly important to lay the wicket for politicians to then have the economic discussion. So I am happy for fora such as this. I am happy for the role that the University of the West Indies is playing. I am happy for our multilateral partners that are here. I'm happy for our NGOs because these discussions will become more critical. They're certainly critical on the mitigation side and absolutely critical on the adaptation side. When one contemplates that the coastal revetment done in front of Raytown and the raising of the road there for a kilometer of road to be climate resilient was close to $10 million US. And we contemplate that to de-risk the investment that is Kingston and St. Andrew, you have 28 kilometers of that to do. That will trigger no new job, that unlocks no new investment. It simply de-risks the investments already made behind. It protects lives, it protects livelihoods. So it is a duty of the government. But no new economic activity comes from that size investment, as opposed to when you do a road bypass in somewhere like St. James and it cuts travel time from the airport to Negril by 45 minutes. It unlocks new investments in other areas of Hanover, etc. That project is the same size as a coastal revetment that will not have that impact. It may reduce the insurance premiums that Liz spoke about, but it doesn't unlock new investments. It simply de-risks ones that are there before. So when one contemplates that your adaptation plans have to have the mix of nature-based solutions, a mix of climate-resilient infrastructure, have to contemplate citizens at the center of these plans and have to contemplate making investments in many cases that to make them climate-resilient are way more expensive than some of the infrastructure we'd have built in the past. These are tough discussions. When you're going to build to particular specifications that you haven't really built within the past, and people say, well, why is this project costing so much? And now you're unable to do other projects that you need to do. The science has to be understood to get you the political space to do these things. The reality is, regardless of how we feel in this room, if we are not able to convince those not in this room that these are the appropriate steps, these steps cannot be taken. That's the nature of the democratic will of our people. That's the nature of our democracy. So this is important. I think it's one discussion in many that have to happen. But this one is particularly important as the World Bank would have announced that, yes, its board has approved the loss and damage fund being housed and managed from the World Bank just this week. So loss and damage is coming to come. How it comes to come, I think will be determined a lot by what is discussed here this afternoon, and I'm eager to join the discussions and to learn as well. So I look forward to your presentation. I thank you for the opportunity to join you, Prof. Taylor, and certainly anytime we can support, we shall.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you for the connection, because we have had from an embassy, we've had from CRIF, a donor, partner, sharer, contributor, and we have from the political directorate. We're going to hear, however, from the heart of the science, and just before we do, to ensure that it comes in the right way, as I've been to 3 of the sessions, and Francois has been moderating many of them. And I see in the room various persons. And one person I saw, I realized is going to be introducing our keynote speaker. A graduate student in the Department of Physics, Candice Charlton, has been asked, volunteered, requested to introduce our guest speaker. And I think she might have collated notes over the last couple of days to make this introduction. So I invite you, Candice, to come forward.
Senator the Honorable Matthew Samuda, Minister with a portfolio in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. Mrs. Pamusa Makendi, Councillor Political at the South African High Commission. Professor Michael Taylor, Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology. Professor Dale Weber, Chairman of the Climate Change Advisory Board and Director of the Center of Marine Sciences and our chair for this event. Our esteemed speaker, Professor Francois Engelbrecht. Ms. Elizabeth Emmanuel, Head of the Technical Assistance and Corporate Manager Team at the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is my esteemed pleasure to introduce to you this evening our speaker. I did not make as detailed notes as you think I did. I was in and out for various reasons. However, we do have some information about him that we can share. Professor Francois Engelbrecht is the director of the Global Change Institute and professor of climatology at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. He is a lead author on the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report and the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. He holds a PhD in meteorology from the University of Pretoria. He specializes in numerical climate model development and the simulation of African climate variability and change. His current research includes a focus on the development of an African-based Earth system model towards participation in the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project Phase 6 of the World Climate Research Program. Today, he will be speaking to us about loss and damages, and specifically on the urgent need for climate change attribution science in the Global South. Please help me to welcome Professor Francois Engelbrecht.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Candice, for the very kind introduction. Much appreciated. Good afternoon from my side to Minister Samuda, my compatriot, Ms. Mukendi, Professors Weber and Taylor and Stevenson, Ms. Emmanuel, good to see you again as well. Colleagues and fellow scientists, all protocol observed, as the South Africans like to say. Good afternoon from my side. It's a great privilege to visit Kingston in Jamaica for the first time. Wonderful to have made this trip as a South African. And yes, an important topic we are discussing, so important, I think, for both our countries. The increasing impacts of climate change, loss and damage, and the science of how we link the changing climate to these increasing impacts and damages we are experiencing across the world. For us as the scientists, it is magnificent to see the Minister in the room, to see the South African High Commission in the room. We realize very much that our science is only worth that much if it has this opportunity to find uptake in policy. I'm very happy to say that in my own country, there's a long tradition of the government being willing to listen to and interact with the climate scientists. And since I've landed here in Kingston, I've immediately realized it's the same in Jamaica. And not all scientists in all countries have this privilege of having this level of representation at their meetings. That communication line between science and policy doesn't exist everywhere. I think we are very privileged in our countries as the scientists to have that. We've had a wonderful week of interacting. We still have to make some big decisions tomorrow. I think Professors Weber and Stevenson and Taylor, I think we have reassurances here that our plans of a self-self collaboration is going to have strong political backing. For that we are grateful. To my fellow scientists, I've tested some of my own ideas towards this talk with you today. I apologize, you're going to see many slides many slides again. Please, I won't mind if you open your laptops and start working on other things. But with all of that being said, let us share some interactions on the science of attribution and loss and damage. Let me start to point out that I think, despite the noble efforts of both our countries at the climate negotiations of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we have to face today the reality that the first dangerous threshold of global warming is dawning upon us. So we are living in the days of 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. As we've been discussing over the last week, the last 12 months have been the warmest on record. June last year until May this year, that 12-month period was 1.63 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average temperature. So the first 12-month period that exceeded the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold was February last year till January this year. So these are now the first 12-month periods in the historical record that exceed that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. And we are probably already living in the first decade that will be 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial average. And that means we have to start to face a very hard reality that the implementation of the Paris Agreement has been too slow. It has failed in terms of preventing us exceeding the first dangerous threshold of global warming. The IPCC, through its work in the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, where I, by the way, was reporting to Professor Taylor for many years while we wrote the report. That report found that a 1.5 degrees Celsius world is a more dangerous world. And that is the world that is now dawning in front of our eyes. I just want to say a few words about climate change mitigation and to build up towards our topic of loss and damage today and attribution. Those were the projected pathways into the future, the scenarios of mitigation used by the IPCC in the 6th assessment report, published in 2021. And those light blue and dark blue lines, they are high mitigation futures, Paris Agreement type futures. And the red lines, of course, are the fossil fuel type futures. Reality, I think most climate scientists think, will be somewhere in between. But when this report was written in 2021, and when the special report was written and published in 2018, our chance to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming depended on drastic emission cuts starting in the early 2020s. And achieving a 45% reduction in emissions, more or less, by 2030, with respect to, say, the 2015 levels. Now, that hasn't happened. And that is why the IPCC reached the assessment in 2021 that even if in 2021 we started with strong mitigation, it would be more likely than not that the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold of global warming will be exceeded. And 3 years later, we've seen the first individual year exceeding the threshold. So this means, I think in 2024, it's now, I think the IPCC, if it should make the assessment now, it would say it's unlikely that we can still stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. But the good news is, the chance is still excellent to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, if that strong mitigation effort starts now. Right. And I see some of the scientists are smiling, right? That's what we said about 1.5 degrees, right? Now we are saying it about 2. So we have to prepare for climate change impacts. In the global south, we have to prepare for what's coming. The 1.5 degrees Celsius world can no longer be avoided. So it is about climate change adaptation. But it is also about realizing the reality that there are also limits to climate change adaptation. And we can't phase out the coal and oil that is still being used so widely overnight. There is a commitment to further warming. And that means there will also be impacts that cannot be avoided. And that is why loss and damage is such an important discussion today in the global south. I want to share some examples today of what is happening in my part of the world. September last year, given the current geopolitics that are so sensitive and in turmoil across the world, I think so many of us have already forgotten what happened in Libya in September last year. 11,000 people died in one day in the biggest flood in living memory. I'll talk later on in this talk about what happened there, why it happened, what was the role of climate change. But it was a massive flood event. 2 dams broke their walls. And I'll show later on that there's very strong evidence that climate change was a main driver of the event. So for me, it shows the immense risks. Recently, just a few days ago, so eloquently described by the United Nations Secretary General, when he said that the world is on a highway to climate hell. That was the words of the United Nations Secretary General. And in Africa, we are seeing this. 11,000 people lost in one day. The reality is that the 1.5 degrees Celsius world is a more dangerous world. It's not only a projection, it's an observation. So increases in extreme weather events can already be detected in every region of the world. And the climate model projections are clear that we can expect further increases in a 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer world. The next important point to make is that there will be clear limits to adaptation. And that is where our discussion this week was focused on. Despite our best efforts in terms of adapting across the global south, we cannot avoid all of these impacts. And therefore, my own country has been really, I think, instrumental in achieving the international agreements reached last year in terms of operationalizing a loss and damage fund. I'll speak about this also in more detail today. But what is going to become increasingly important is the science that tells us when an extreme event can be attributed to climate change, and also when climate change played a role in making an extreme event even more intense, or is making extreme events more frequent in terms of occurring. So the chain of thinking is, the world is warming, we are committed to further warming, we cannot adapt fast enough, there are limits to adaptation, so there will be losses and there will be damage. In a climate-just future, there will be compensation for those losses. But there's also a science that is needed. The science that tells us when an extreme event is there purely because of natural variability and when climate change did play a role in the occurrence of the extreme. So, as we meet here this week, can we already answer this question? Do we have the science to formally quantify the role of climate change in extreme events? That's what attribution science is. Now, saying this respectfully in the presence of Minister Samuda and my compatriot, Ms. Mukendi, the politicians apparently think that we can answer the question. Let me show you some examples of the recent past. I'll start in my own country. This was the Durban flood. The Durban flood occurred in April 2022, as Ms. Mukendi will know, the biggest disaster, the biggest flood disaster in the history of South Africa. 544 people died in 2 days in a big flood event in the city of Durban. The damages are estimated to have been about 3.5 billion US dollars. So a massive loss in South Africa, also the worst flood in terms of losses in South Africa's history. And it was caused by a cut-off low weather system that brings flooding about twice every year on the average in South Africa. It was not unprecedented, the amount of rainfall, but in this case the rainfall fell in such a highly populated area that we've had these tremendous losses of life. Now, the day after the floods, our President Ramaphosa, was on the scene. He met with the communities, as a president should do, of course. And then he made an important statement, namely that one day after the event, he said, "This disaster is part of climate change. It is telling us that climate change is serious. It is here." So he said, he effectively made an attribution statement one day after the event. So Ms. Mukendi, I don't want to make you too nervous, but later on in this talk, I'm going to show the science, whether the president was right or not in making the statement. Okay. The scientific answer is coming up. But afterwards, of course, this created a debate in South Africa, because there were, of course, groups that said the president was blaming climate change for things the government didn't do in terms of making communities less vulnerable, right? The hard reality is, in my country, we have hundreds of millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people, who live below floodlines. And that's a hard reality. Across Africa, the cities are growing fast, and they're growing informally. So there's a tremendous exposure to flood risk. But we'll get back to this. Now, here's an interesting example pointed out to me by our German visitor this week, Dr. Biskup. Just a few days ago, the German Chancellor also found himself within a community after a major flood event. And let's see what he said, also one day after the floods, right? He says, such floods were no longer a one-off event. So he says this is becoming more frequent, these big flood events. This is an indication that something is up here. And then he says we must not neglect the task of stopping man-made climate change. The floods were a warning that we must take with us. So effectively he's also saying climate change is making these events more frequent. They are no longer one-off events. We have to mitigate climate change. We have to take note of the fact that this is becoming a part of our future in Germany. So I think very, very similar claims made by my own president 2 years ago. And yes, the last example I show in this context, a very important example. In August 2022 and September, extreme monsoon floods resulted in 1/3 of Pakistan, literally 1/3 of Pakistan being underwater. A massive flood event, countrywide. And while these floods were still ongoing, appeared on television once again the United Nations Secretary General. And he said, this is a monsoon on steroids. Right. So he also linked the floods to climate change. And then the Prime Minister of Pakistan made an important number of statements. He said, what happened in Pakistan will not stay in Pakistan. So he means, today it's my country, tomorrow it's Jamaica, the next month it's South Africa. So it's climate change affecting all of us. And then he said something that is relevant to our meeting today. Why are my people paying the price of such high global warming through no fault of their own? So if you look at the cumulative emissions, Pakistan is only responsible up until now for less than 0.5% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. So, therefore the Prime Minister of Pakistan made his final statement. It is therefore entirely reasonable to expect some approximation of justice for this loss and damage. So he's saying there must be fair compensation for a developing country such as Pakistan, who is not responsible for the global warming problem after being impacted to this high extent. So colleagues, I think these examples really set the scene of why we are here. Increasing climate change impacts is a reality. And from that reality, I think the developing countries have moved forward, and with some strong support from the global north last year, including from, I think we should say, the European Union, the agreement of 2027 became operational. So the 2027 agreement was to establish the Loss and Damage Fund. Last year it became operational, and some symbolic payments of funding has already been made into the fund. So, of course, the fund aims in spirit. Its spirit is to provide assistance to the developing countries of the world, the most vulnerable countries, when they are being impacted by extreme weather events driven by climate change. How quickly will this fund really get off the ground? How quickly will it really have a substantial amount of funding to work with? I'm sure Ms. Emmanuel is monitoring that as actively as we are. Right. These are key questions. How long before this fund really has the opportunity to make a difference? So let me point out that there are already really positive developments happening. After the Pakistan floods, even before the fund was operational, and before it became into existence at the end of 2022, several donors, several countries and economic blocs did pledge $9 billion for funding relief to Pakistan after the floods. And much of that funding has indeed been flowing. So let us also realize that there are also positive developments. There are many countries and economic blocs that I think are sincere in their intention to support the global south following severe climate impacts in global south countries. So there are really also some positive developments taking place. All of that sets the scene for us as the scientists. We need to become as strong as we possibly can and as efficient as we possibly can in supporting our countries, the policymakers, the important insurance companies, in their efforts to take care of these compensations and the flow of funds to countries affected by climate change. That means we need to strengthen attribution science. The stronger scientific evidence we can provide to the policymakers when the time comes of an extreme event that climate change did play a role, the stronger will be their case to pursue climate justice through loss and damage funding. And that's our task as the scientists, is to make the science solid. In some cases, I'm sure we will also conclude, if our science is objective, that climate change did not play a particularly important role in a specific event. That will also happen now and then. So from that basis, if I should today make a quick summary of where we are in terms of the science of attribution, so that is objectively determining the role of climate change in an extreme event, I would firstly say that we as the scientists have responded. And over the last decade, a solid foundation for climate change attribution science has emerged. We've discussed it this week. Today there are two main approaches that are already operational in many global north countries, namely the so-called probabilistic approach to climate change attribution, and secondly the so-called event-based approach to climate change attribution. We won't discuss these in much detail today, but I'll just say that these methodologies are so advanced now that in some institutes they are already operational. I mean that within a month, with this I mean that typically within 1 month after an extreme event has occurred, there's a formal scientific assessment available of whether climate change played a role in the event or not. And the pioneering international consortium that has led this work is known as World Weather Attribution. And its technologies are largely based on so-called global circulation models or global climate models. The scientists here will know what I'm talking about, with these models all being based in global north countries. However, frequently this specific consortium also undertakes climate change attribution studies for developing countries in the global south. So what is the purpose of these attribution studies? Well, as I have mentioned, it is certainly to inform loss and damage considerations, but this science also gives us the ability to understand how climate change altered an extreme weather event. And that's important because the better that understanding is, the better is our anticipation of future extreme events. So because climate change attribution science also helps us to understand how climate change is changing extremes, it directly feeds into adaptation science as well. And it also builds the case to avoid further increases in these events by mitigating climate change. So climate change attribution science is also of fundamental importance for climate change adaptation and mitigation. Now, it is unfortunately also so that there is a major gap in attribution science in global south countries. Right. Currently, there is no attribution modeling system that is operational in any global south country. I'll soon show some examples of the developments happening in South Africa. So there are positive developments, and that is why we are here. But let me first demonstrate why I'm saying there's this major gap, and then how we should respond as the global south scientists. I'll just show 2 or 3 examples. This is tropical cyclone Idai, just before it made landfall in Beira in Mozambique on the 14th of March 2019. And this system was a Category 4 hurricane in the Mozambique Channel, just before it made landfall. It killed more than 1,500 people in Mozambique mostly, but also in Malawi and Zimbabwe. This is the biggest loss of life in the history of Africa from a tropical cyclone. And the hard reality is, until this day, there has been no attribution study undertaken for tropical cyclone Idai. If we had a technology in South Africa or Mozambique, we would have done it, but we didn't have the technology at the time. Right now, my region, Southern Africa, where I live, has experienced a devastating drought. My colleagues in Zambia, northern Namibia, Botswana are telling me it's the worst in the historical record. Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, 3 Southern African countries, have declared nationwide states of disaster. And following this drought, the SADC development community, a strong consortium of Southern African countries, have just launched a formal appeal for what they call life-saving financial support for the communities affected by this drought. In this part of the world, there are literally millions of people who rely on subsistence farming. If the crop fails, there's no food for many households. And I think if we were ready in South Africa or in Zambia, for example, with an operational attribution system, if we were able to quantify right now the role of climate change in the drought, in the context of this international support around loss and damage, the SADC countries would have had even a stronger case for their funding appeal. So, there are clear gaps. In the Global South, we just don't have the technologies right now to do the attribution studies I think we'd like to do. It's certainly true for Africa. I think from what I've learned this week, it remains also true in the Caribbean. So how do we respond? Professors Taylor and Stevenson and myself had some discussion some months ago about the state of attribution modeling in the Southern Hemisphere. And I've shared with them the progress we've made in the last 2 years since the Durban floods in building an attribution modeling capability in South Africa. So it is based at our institute, the Global Change Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And all the regional climate modelers, my fellow climate scientists here in the room will know what I mean when I say this system is based on a so-called high-resolution regional climate model, specifically a new type of climate model that we call a kilometer scale model. It's a type of climate model that is purposefully designed to simulate the impacts of climate change on really intense storm systems, including subtropical lows such as the one that caused the Durban flood, but also tropical cyclones, or as you refer to these systems, hurricanes. All our simulations happen on our National Center for High Performance Computing. Now, can we build such systems in the Caribbean and in Africa? Is it possible financially? This is a thought specifically for the scientists in the audience. You know, we are currently hearing now about the drive for kilometer scale modeling globally. Kilometer scale models are simply climate models that run at a spatial resolution of about 1 kilometer, or in the order of 1 kilometer, say 4 kilometers. They can simulate intense weather systems such as thunderstorms, mesoscale lows, hurricanes, in more detail than the global climate models can. Now, right now, one of the biggest thrusts in climate modeling internationally is to develop these kilometer scale models that can run across the entire globe. It's a vision at the moment. To run them, you will need a so-called exascale computer. All right. To make that real, that's a computer that has about 1 million CPUs that it it can use at the same moment, in parallel. Okay. Minister Samuda, this will cost about 600 million US. But the good news, it's not what we are looking for. Because in the Global South countries, we've become, I think, really good in running a different type of climate model that can also answer the attribution question, namely the regional climate model. When we run these climate models at resolutions of a few kilometers but over smaller areas, they become computationally much more expensive. And I think it is within the reach of our envisaged South-South consortium to obtain computing systems that we can use to do these types of studies with the kilometer scale event attribution climate models on much smaller computing systems that use in the order of 1,000 to 10,000 CPUs. That's more or less what we need. And these can be obtained with funding in the order of a few million US dollar, which I think is achievable. It is achievable. I hope Ms. Mukendi would agree, because we will have, of course, with the help of our own countries and with the international community, which I think is really supporting climate science in the Global South, we need to build more of these systems in Global South countries. But this is achievable. I think funding in the order of $1 million US is achievable in our respective countries for these types of modeling systems. So now I'd just like to show briefly how the system worked in the case of the Durban floods. I won't go into all the technical details, but effectively an event attribution modeling system relies on simulating the weather event that caused the disaster in a world that is cooler than today's world. So effectively the methodology explores how the weather system would have behaved if we haven't burnt all this coal and oil to warm the atmosphere. Okay. So we have numerical modeling techniques to take the weather system and insert it into that theoretically cooler world. And then what we also do, as depicted by those three arrows, to understand the dynamics of climate change in the evolution of the extreme weather event, we also insert the weather system in a world that has been warmed theoretically. So effectively, we have the technologies now in South Africa to explore how a weather event would have behaved in a world that was not anthropogenically warmed. And that essentially gives us the tool to then statistically determine how climate change made the event more intense, or maybe of longer duration. So we have built such a system. The climate scientists will know here what I mean when I say we run ensembles of different realizations of the weather event in today's world, the cooler world, the warmer world. And that runs on the Center for High Performance Computing, the only high-performance computer in Africa, sponsored by South Africa's Department of Science and Innovation. And without that government investment, we also would not have been able to do this type of study. So in our case, it was a clear and important investment from government that made this type of study possible. So to show the results, obtained recently. It took some time to develop this capability. Just very briefly, if we look there at the top few graphs, the top graphs on the left-hand side compares how the rainfall in Durban in South Africa was different compared to what it would have been if the world has not gone through this anthropogenic warming. So in that specific simulation, we removed from today's climate system, the temperature trend, to achieve the cooler world. And you can see that rainfall totals are simulated to have been about 40% higher, a staggering 40% higher, during those 2 days in April 2022 compared to what it would have been if we didn't have global warming. In the second experiment at the right, we've removed also the moisture trends, because remember, a warmer atmosphere is also a more moist atmosphere. So if you also restore the moisture to what it would have looked like in a world without anthropogenic warming, then you can see the wet region is now simulated to have occurred over even a larger region. But both the experiments suggest that climate change made the rainfall that caused the Durban flood about 40% higher than it was supposed to be. So, yeah, Ms. McKinley, what did the President say? He said this event was part of climate change. He didn't say climate change caused it. He said it was part of climate change. Climate change made it worse. He was 100% correct. Amazing, huh? The science confirmed. So, in this case, there was a confirmation. In other cases, other attribution studies published, climate change did not play a role in the event. But in this case, it did. So the science tells us. So I would say climate change attribution technologies are ready to roll out operationally. There's a different approach. It's called the probability-based approach. It relies on the existing global climate model projections freely available from international consortia of modeling agencies, including the important modeling experiment that supports the IPCC assessment reports, known as CMIP6. In this case, all that you need to do that approach, to apply that approach, is a large computer with a lot of storage. You don't really need that much compute. That other technology is rolling out operationally across the world almost every month now. Here's an example. That approach was used to study what happened in the case of Libya, published by the World Weather Attribution Consortium, and they found that the weather system that caused that event has been made 50 times more likely by climate change. So that event that killed 11,000 people was made 50 times more likely by climate change. That was the assessment. Published almost within a month of the event. And just I think because we are in the Caribbean, I can just mention that event was called by a weather system that is now becoming known as a Medicane. It's a low-pressure system that develops over the Mediterranean Sea. But because the Mediterranean Sea is nowadays warmer than it's supposed to be, these weather systems increasingly assume properties that make them look like hurricanes. So they're now called Medicanes. And that's the weather system. It caused 400 millimeters of rain in one day in the Derna region in Libya. And in that part of the world, the average rainfall in September when the disaster occurred is 4 millimeters. So the 400 millimeters just overwhelmed the dams. But here I've now shown you two examples, just two brief examples, for Durban and for Derna, where the science of attribution is giving us very clear guidance of the role of climate change in the actual events. So, second last slide before I conclude. You know, we as the climate scientists will have to increasingly interact with the policymakers when it comes to loss and damage. What should our respective roles be? I can only share with you my own personal view, which is also the position of the Global Change Institute in South Africa. Our position is to provide policy-relevant, objective assessments of the role of climate change in a specific weather event to all stakeholders interested in working with this knowledge. So that may be guidance that we are providing to SADC in terms of whether the recent drought was intensified by climate change or not, so that SADC can strengthen its appeal for international support. But we can also provide that information to, say, activistic organizations such as the Center for Environmental Rights in South Africa, who in the context of the Durban floods is making the statement that the polluter must pay for the disaster. So the Center for Environmental Rights in South Africa has been making the case that our big fossil fuel companies in South Africa, Ms. McKenny, you'd know them, of course, Eskom, Sasol, Exxaro, should pay a portion of those damages because, according to their responsibility for the warming today. So my view as the climate scientists is that we should not become involved in choosing sides in these discussions. There are many other experts that can do that. We must provide an objective assessment. So if there is a court case about loss and damage in the future, whether it is a Caribbean country suing global north countries, or whether it is the Center for Environmental Rights in my country suing Sasol, the scientists must appear in court and simply give the objective outcome of the attribution, detection, and modeling exercise, without saying you should pay you. I think, colleagues, this is going to become increasingly important. We need to preserve our objectivity as scientists. I see many of my colleagues not being able, becoming desperate, seeing the impacts in our region, in our continent, taking the next step of becoming activists themselves. My view is, I don't think it's the right thing to do. Because the moment that you have an agenda as an activist, you are no longer being regarded as objective. So I think loss and damage is going to test all of us as climate scientists in this respect. My view is, let's give the objective scientists to the courts, to the governments, to the activists, to make use of the science as they all see fit. To conclude then, let me say that I think as the extreme events are increasing across the world, I think we can just switch on the television. We can all see they are increasing. Unfortunately, the 1.5 degree world is just dawning. There will be further increases. So I think it is very clear. Loss and damage will become an increasingly important discussion globally. Operationalizing it via the fund transfers will become increasingly important. It's very likely that climate change attribution science will only become more important over the next 5 to 10 years. It is essential that we have the capability in the global south to make our own assessments of whether climate change made an event worse or not. We've seen over the last few days so few studies of loss and damage and specifically attributing losses and damages in the Caribbean to climate change. We must capacitate ourselves to be able to independently undertake these studies. So, I think we need to do this in research mode, first and foremost. We must build research capabilities through which we are ready to roll out this probabilistic approach to loss and damage, which in many cases I think is the best approach, especially when it comes to, for example, the recent heat and drought in the Caribbean. I think we need a probabilistic approach. The data is there. In terms of event attribution, that is the best approach, I think the science tells us, for intense storm systems. That's really important in the Caribbean. For that, we need more intense computational capability. It's important to do these approaches with so-called multi-model systems to avoid the risk of results being model dependent. That's another reason why a self-self collaboration can really change the landscape in terms of attributing extreme events in the global south to climate change. So I would say the self-self consortiums, they can make such a big difference. If we apply our minds to this with the support of our governments and in the international funding agencies, I believe we will be able to build the critical modeling capacity and the critical human capacity to undertake these studies, especially if we collaborate across countries. That's our way to get the critical capacity to undertake these studies also in an operational manner. And then finally, as I've mentioned, I think our job is to do the objective science, to inform policy, to inform the legal cases that are coming, to inform the strategies of the insurance industries and companies. So with that, colleagues, these are challenging times. These are challenging times in a global warming world. But as I've mentioned, there are also many positive aspects. Firstly, and I'll conclude with this, we can still avoid a 2 degrees Celsius threshold of global warming. We can avoid many of these losses. But if we can't, because it's not in the first place in the hands of the developing countries, if the global north does not take that strong policy towards strong emission cuts, not a strong if they don't take the strong actions in terms of emission cuts, the best we can do is to project our likely futures, to adapt, and to get our attribution science as strong as possible to help us with the adaptation, but also to help us make our case for future loss and damage considerations, which is now a formally agreed United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change principle. Thanks, everyone. It was great to spend this time with you in Kingston. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Engelbrecht, for a sobering but valuable lesson in terms of what we have done, what we can do, and a few notes about where we can go next. I'm going to take 2 questions, if there are any burning questions from members of the audience. David, why your hand gone up already? So 2 burning questions so that we can test Professor Engelbrecht's theories some more, and then we will move on to our cocktails outside. David.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I can see how your method works very nicely in the examples you gave. How applicable and easy is it to apply to a slow onset event, like, for example, it's just getting warmer and warmer, or it's just not rained in a long period of time? I can see sudden onset works fine for me. What about slow onset?
Yes, I think, so this specific methodology, event attribution, which in the meantime has become kilometer scale event attribution, because we can now do these simulations at these really high resolutions, has originally been designed for the attribution of the role of climate change in North Atlantic landfalling hurricanes. The methodology was originally designed around the impact of Hurricane Harvey. So it's absolutely designed for the intense storm systems, the quick onset events. But I've been pondering your question, even at this workshop. Can it be applied for longer onset events, specifically drought? And I don't think it has ever been done, but I think if one uses the framework of seasonal forecasting, and one uses large ensembles of seasonal predictions that are generated for today's warmer world and then are repeated in a cooler world, it's probably going to be a similar type of setup. So I think right now for the slow onset events, we have an excellent tool available, which has become the standard approach to attribution, namely the probability-based assessments. So when it comes to determining whether drought played a role, whether climate change played a role in a seasonal drought, for example, in the Caribbean or in Africa, the probability-based method is really probably good enough to answer the question. I think it is possible to supplement that with this type of event type system that runs at seasonal timescales. But it's an interesting question. I think the science still needs to grow in that respect. But right now, for the slow onset events, we do have the probability-based method that I think is really good enough to give us a good idea of the role of climate change in changing the frequency of these slow onset events and the intensity.
Thank you, and thank you for the question, David. The other question I saw coming was Georgiana.
Thank you, Prof. That was a brilliant presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question is a simple one. I'm looking at the floods that happened in Kenya and Tanzania in April of this year that left 503,661 people displaced. And I wondered if your center has started any work on trying to figure out whether this particular flood was, it can be attributed to climate change.
So it is really interesting. In my part of the world, East Africa and Southern Africa are affected in opposite ways by El Niño. So El Niño typically makes Southern Africa dry, and I've mentioned the big drought, but at the same time, the same changes in circulation result in East Africa being wet. And right now, our institute has embarked on exploring the role of climate change in the drought. It is a perfectly valid question to also explore the role of climate change in the floods in East Africa. Now, in both of these cases, the widely applied probability-based approach to attribution is probably perfectly suitable to explore the role of climate change in both these events. Your question is important in the sense that it points to a lack of human capacity. At our institute, it will take us a few months to complete the Southern African study. I know there are East African colleagues that are also thinking of strengthening their capacity in undertaking attribution studies at the Kenyan Weather Service. I haven't touched base with them on the recent floods, but my hope is that they would take the lead and do the study for East Africa. So also in Africa, we have work to do in strengthening our human capacity and our ability to also do these types of studies operationally. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Engelbrecht, and thank you for your questions. As we come to the close of our public lecture, we would like to give a small token to our esteemed lecturer, and I'm going to call on Darren to bring a vote of thanks and to make this small token presentation.
Good night. At this point in the evening, I hope I'll be forgiven by saying all protocols observed. With that said, Prof. Engelbrecht, it is my honor to, on behalf of the Faculty of Science and Technology, as well as the University of West Indies, give a vote of thanks first and foremost for being here. Second, for actually defining attribution science for us and really emphasizing the need for the science, how we can go about doing it, and also setting the stage for the partnerships that will make it possible for us to achieve the attribution science. With that said, I won't keep us away from the cocktails very long. So thank you again, Prof. Engelbrecht, and it's been an honor to have you here.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing with us. I think we have learned a lot here today. We have had our minds opened. It started off a little depressing, and I worried where we were going to end up, but I think the ray of hope did come through, and the South-South Cooperation is clearly going to make a difference in how we approach what we're going to do going forward. The opportunity that has been presented to us allows us now to redouble our efforts to decide whether Minister can find that $1 million US to get us the computing power that we need to match what's there, and for us to have the mental aptitude and capacity to put our minds at work so that we can come up with a South-South cooperation to provide the best advice without getting involved in the decision to take advantage of attribution. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much. Have a good evening and share cocktails with us.